Welcome. We are here to talk about creative sequencing. And there's a lot at the moment about how we need to be creative all the time. And I really just wanted to share that there is a balance to these things, that of course it's really wonderful to be creative and inspiring. But there's also a really big role for familiarity to play so that our students feel safe and they know what's going on in the practice. And ultimately, we really want class to be conveying something about yoga, whatever our intention is to share with the yoga. So there's a balance between what's creative and what's familiar. And I'm sure that you already have all sorts of wonderful ways to be creative. So whatever you're doing, it's most likely already enough. But of course, it's wonderful to add in something new. Often when we think about creativity, we imagine this great big field, this vast realm of creativity. But actually, to get super creative, it helps if we narrow things down. So if we put some constraints around our creativity, then it channels the creativity in a much more effective way. We're going to lay some groundwork, and that is going to form a great big map, a great big landscape within which all of our class planning is going to take place. And this is the basis, the foundation for my 6-step sequencing strategy that I share in my online creative sequencing course, as well as in studio in my intensives. I've got my notes. So the first step is to simply create a structure that we cycle through in any series of classes. So for example, you might want to think of a 6-week class structure. The thing that I find most useful is to imagine starting from the feet and working the way up the body. So week 1 would be, say, you'd think more of feet and legs and do something related to that. And you could tie that in with a theme, like something around the chakras or the descending prana, the apana vayu, or you could work with the fascia of the feet and the legs. And then the second week would go to the hips. The third week you'd focus more around the abdomen or the spine, etc. And you work your way up. And you can adapt that to suit you. You can adapt it each time you cycle through. But it means you haven't got to think at the beginning of each week, oh, what am I working with this week? It's all just set for you. And it also means that we can work more deeply with anatomy, if that's what you want to work with. If you've got quite a set sequence that you use, so some of people who have come from like an Ashtanga background, or you teach a very vinyasari class, you can still use the same thing, even if the class structure stays relatively similar. It just gives you some focal points, again, for your creativity and for some novelty. And we know that novelty is so good for the brain, because it means that your brain gets something new to work with, and it's good for the body, because when we map the body well in the brain with new movement, we're less prone to pain. So that's just the first step, really simply setting yourself up a structure. And then from that, what we do is we map onto that any particular theme, and that then you can break that down week by week. So you can tie in any readings or meditations or breath work that work with the theme that week. So we could think of a more grounding breath work or a more grounding rooting meditation, etc. So then we're going to have a think about this foundational aspect of mapping the poses. And what this really means is that instead of thinking of each pose as a single individual entity, we are going to imagine it as a spectrum of possibilities. And when we do that, we end up with a whole interwoven map of poses. So you can walk along any one route and you'll see where it crisscrosses with other poses. It sounds a bit intellectual, but what we do is instead of sitting there and thinking about it, we're going to move, and we're going to move together, so feel free to join in. And we'll just take one action of the body, map that, and then you'll start to get an idea of how this works. And then if you want to join me in the course, we'll be doing this much more, and we'll end up with this great big movement map, so that instead of having to plan in ultimate detail every single class, we'll have a sense of travel or a sense of direction for every class that week. And then its exact location on the map will vary according to who's there and what their specific needs are, as well as, of course, the structure of the class, so whether it's more a vinyasa class or a yin class, etc. Let's go. We'll do some shoulder movement. Come and join me if you'd like to. So instead of thinking of any one specific pose, we're going to take a movement of the body, and then we're going to trace its evolution through lots of different poses. And that means that instead of in our class plan having like one peak pose that we're going to, which might suit one class or one group of students, we've got a much more broad spectrum of movement. And so when it comes to planning our classes for that week, we're going to take them as a whole, so less planning time. And then we can just slot in to each class, whichever area of that movement spectrum seems most suitable. We're going to take shoulder flexion, so that's moving the arms forward and up into flexion at the glenohumeral joint. And we're just going to play with it. So come and join me. We'll start from standing, give your arms a bit of movement, bit of a swing. Just be playful, so, adding in a little dip at the knees. So not being too addicted to it having to be yoga asana, but thinking more broadly that yoga can be any exploration that brings about a sense of ease or a sense of connection. We could take the arms rigidly, firmly up and try and keep the ribs down, so kind of working more with stability. We could think of rooting down as we reach up, so thinking more of both directions, maybe that apana sinking and the prana lifting. We could think of going wide and up, so that's abduction then. We've kind of changed the direction and we're getting a bit of rotation at the shoulders. And then we could think what happens if I add a prop. So we could hold a belt and go more into mobility work. Again, we're going to keep the body quite stable, so without the ribs flaring forward for now. And see how wide do you need to go in your belt, if you've got a belt there. And then we could see what happens if I squeeze a prop, like a brick, and you'll find you get more co-contraction of muscles, more firming of the muscles around the shoulder joint. I could imagine sinking the feet again and reaching up super, super high. And then I could think, oh, what if the shoulder doesn't want to move so far? How could I reduce the range of movement at the arms? What could I do from here, etc. And then we could think, okay, so if it was a forward fold, we would also be having the arms up, so we could go to any kind of a forward fold. If that was tricky for someone, where would I go into that flexion of the spine? Hands could be higher so that I'm not needing to move the shoulders quite so much. Stepping back. And then we could think what other poses have this action, and we could look at the gomukhasana shape. So one arm high, one arm behind. Again, we're getting a bit of rotation at the shoulders here, and we could just play with going towards that action, or holding a belt, or holding the arm. So this again is the flexion in this arm. This action here is the shoulder extension. And then we could take that down to the ground. So we could say, okay, well, we've got flexion in the shoulders here and in the forward fold. We've got it in down dog. So we could walk into some kind of a dog position. And then we could think, oh, instead of bearing all the weight here, how could I bear less weight? And we end up in puppy pose. If this was too strong for someone, what else could I do? Or we could be here, or we could just be in tabletop where the arm is less moved forward, less flexed at the shoulder joint. If somebody was super bendy here, they could get more into that spinal movement. If they were quite strong there, they could even lift the knees and still stay in a puppy position. And then we could say, oh, what other directions could easily come in here? Oh, I could go into a twist. So now you see we start to build together different movements, which are going to create like a movement phrase. And this is going to be another key part of our sequencing strategy. I could move back to Malasana, into a squat pose, and reach up and open. Because if we have movement phrases instead of move by move, again, that whole planning of the classes is going to be so much easier. And I'm going to walk the arms forward. It's going to bring me into a plank where, again, the shoulders are flexed, albeit just to more or less 90 degrees. So we could have our play through all different sort of, plank positions. And now it's gone into abduction out to the side, but from flexion. And then I could bring it into a lunge position. And then we know that in the low lunge or high lunge, we also have shoulder flexion. And then I could say, oh, what happens if I add in a bit more mobility here? Maybe catch the elbows or move the arms down. We could go into high lunge. So then we come into a whole other family of poses, all of the lunges and the warrior one poses, etc. Warrior three. So we're just starting to find our way from pose to pose, place to place. Utkatasana fits in here perfectly. We could do that with the fingers interlocked or the arms high, etc. So you get the idea. I'm just trying to trace my way through any movement where I'm having the shoulder still staying in this flexed position so that I get super familiar with what this is. And then I know that this is going to lend itself to shoulder mobility for somebody who's just losing their range of motion, perhaps, somebody who's had an injury or somebody who's getting a bit older. In my strong, bendy lot, I know that this can then take its way into all of the warrior poses, maybe some kind of beautiful gomutasana shape poses, and then you can see that it would come all the way back into Urdhva Dhanurasana, so upward bow pose into a strong back bend. The other way I can think about it is where could I put a really gentle passive version? So I could have a rolled up blanket or a brick or a couple under the shoulders or a bolster. And I could hang out with my shoulders flexed. Something like this or this or this. Whatever felt comfortable for that person. So now I've come into spine extension, the back bend shape of the spine with shoulder flexion. So this might be one person's Urdhva Dhanurasana, one person's full back bend, whereas someone else might feel comfortable to come into, full Urdhva. Haven't actually warmed up beyond this, but we'll see how that goes. Into like full Urdhva Dhanurasana. So just from playing your way through the movement as a possibility of spectrum, you start to get really familiar and much more confident with how different movements link together. So we could perhaps sequence the whole class along this vein, but also how we could choose different chunks of these movement patterns for different classes. And also how we could take one series of that movement as a particular phrase, pop that into the class, and then maybe another phrase later on. So there's lots of different ways from this movement map as a foundation that are going to support a really easeful sequencing strategy for the whole class. Additionally, we can think of how we hold more weight, how we hold less weight through the body to make the poses more challenging. Can you turn the poses upside down? Generally speaking, when you add more directions of travel, so more planes of motion to the body, so this is moving on the sagittal plane, and then this is moving on the frontal plane, and then this is the coronal plane when we're twisting. As you add in more planes of motion, more weight bearing, more balance challenges, obviously all of those things are going to make the poses more tricky. So if you're seeing like, oh, most people can only manage a supported bridge, but this other person can do Urdhva Dhanurasana, full upward bow, then you've got your solution. But maybe that person needs a little bit more challenge to really feel sensation in the body, to really feel connected to the body. Well, then they could lift a leg in upward bow. So you're just always thinking like, where's the next step? Where do I make it easier? And once you've played with that a lot in your own body, not with your books, not just on Instagram or on socials, but in your own body, you'll be so much more confident at planning your whole sequencing strategy. So how does this tie in with actually sequencing a specific class? The key thing is really, I think, to start right from the middle of the class or the peak of the class. Where are you going in that particular class? So let's say we wanted to work with Natarajasana, dancer's pose, Shiva's pose. So it would be a balance. You could have shoulder flexion if you're going this way, but it might be that you want to also offer shoulder extension, so we can just catch a foot this way, but this arm is still going into flexion. So let's say that's our idea for the pose. First of all, let's make it into a spectrum. So we know that it might just come to here. It might come into a balance, so more like a warrior 3. It might come to here, it might come to here, it might go into a quad stretch, etc. So we take the pose and we break down every element of it. So we could just add one element in that class, especially if someone was feeling wobbly. We might know we want the wall, and then it's here, for example. So we're looking from that peak, from Nataraj, and then we're saying, what do we need to add together? What are the component parts of that? And then we could prep each of those component parts. And that is going to give us our warm-up towards that peak pose. I think classes can also be without a peak, but that's just another story. So we'll have a look at that separately. So let's say I was going to do some hip work, I was going to do some hip extension, I was going to do some shoulder mobility, etc. And I was going to do some balance prep. And then I was going to lead towards Natarajasana, etc. So that's that whole first part of the class. You generally need to think about wrists and shoulders, etc. Then I've come to my main pose. I want to get there quite efficiently, so students have got lots of energy. And then all I need to do for that second part of the class, the wind down, we don't need to worry so much about pose and counter pose as we used to say, because the body's not as mechanical as we were often led to believe. So we can just add lots of poses together and then more think of the counter poses. What do we need next for the nervous system? So we've been upregulating with quite a strong practice, let's say. So stimulating the sympathetic nervous system, getting the heart rate up. What are we going to do to slow it down? So literally taking the poses more slowly, taking some more restful poses. Your voice as a teacher calms down, etc. So what's going to feel good for both the body and the nervous system? So often you might want some kind of a side stretch. Let's say we're going to do it from sitting. So if we were on the ground and we were maybe taking like a side reach, and then we were putting in a twist of the spine after our Natarajasana, etc. Or maybe we do it from sitting and then from lying, or just from lying. Whatever it is, we want to feel that we've prepared for our Shavasana, for that calming, settling, softening part of class. So that is a general overview of how we can create a really firm, steady foundation for all of our classes. If you would like much more on this movement map and how to create a really firm foundation, following the sequencing strategy that I have developed over decades, I would love to share it with you. There are so many ways in which we can understand how the same pose can be just a little bit of movement or a great bit of movement, and how then we can teach in ways which are much more inclusive and which can help our students to really stay with us and feel safe. If you are in the course, I cannot wait to share this with you, and thank you all for being here. I hope it's been really helpful.